right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 14th annual Susette M. Talarico Lecture. I'm Dr. Sarah Shannon, and I am the director of the Criminal Justice Studies program, and it's truly my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. This is the first Talarico Lecture that we've been able to hold in person since February of 2020, and so I think this is an especially just momentous and meaningful occasion in that sense. This is also the first Talarico Lecture that I've been able to host as director of the CJ program, so I'm definitely just very delighted to be with you all this afternoon. I think we have a really exciting speaker here today, and Mr. Jim Newton, who will speak to us about police reform. But before we introduce him, I just want to say a few things about the lecture. As many of you know, this annual lecture series is named after Dr. Susette Talarico, who was a UGA faculty member for 3 decades. She was on the faculty in the Department of Political Science from 1977 until 2006, when she retired. And she was the driving force in creating the Criminal Justice Studies program, and she was the director of our program for 22 years. Dr. Talarico won multiple awards for teaching and mentoring, including UGA's prestigious Josiah Miggs Distinguished Teaching Professorship and the American Political Science Association's Law and Courts Teaching and Mentoring Award, in addition to many others. One of my favorite things to do as director of the CJ program is to interact with our incredible alumni. We have so many, and many of them experienced firsthand Dr. Talarico's unparalleled teaching and mentoring. And often when I'm talking with alumni, whether it's inviting them to come and speak to our current students or other ways that I might connect with them, one of the first things that comes out of their mouth is just how fondly they remember their time here learning from Dr. Talarico, and how deep and lasting her influence has been on their successful careers. Frankly, our alumni who learned from Dr. Talarico and were mentored by her say the kinds of things that any kind of dedicated teacher or mentor wants to hear, hopes to hear from their students someday, and that includes me. I really wish I had known Dr. Talarico, because I think that we would have had great conversations, and I know I would have learned so much from her. So I'd like to especially welcome family members that are here today from Dr. Talarico's family. We're honored today to be joined by several members of her family, including her twin sister, Annette, and Annette's husband, Ken, as well as Dr. Talarico's one and only son, Robert, and his wife, Alexis. So thank you all so much for being here today. Yes, and I also want to welcome any other friends. I know Susette had many dear friends here in Athens and at UGA. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Matt Auer, who is Arch Professor of Public and International Affairs and Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs, to introduce our speaker. Dean Auer.
Well, thank you, Dr. Shannon. A special welcome to the family and friends of Susette Talarico. It's an honor to introduce you to our speaker today, Jim Newton. He's a native Californian. Jim Newton is a veteran journalist, author, and teacher. In 25 years at the Los Angeles Times, Newton worked as a reporter, editor, bureau chief, columnist, and state, local, and national government and politics. Ooh, I skipped a line. And that was from 2007 to 2010. It's rather, he's done everything at the Los Angeles Times, so I'm going to take a bogey there. Editor of the editorial page, he's covered Los Angeles City Hall, state, local, and national government and politics. The efforts to reform the LAPD in the 1990s, and the trials of O.J. Simpson and the officers who beat Rodney King, among many other assignments. Newton is the recipient of numerous national and local awards in journalism and participated in 2 staff efforts, coverage of the 1992 riots and the 1994 Northridge earthquake, both of which were awarded the Pulitzer Prize. Before coming to the Times, he was a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and he began his career as the 1985-86 clerk to the New York Times columnist, James Rustin. He is a graduate of Dartmouth College. Newton moved to UCLA full-time in early 2015 to teach in communication studies and public policy, and to found Blueprint, a UCLA magazine, which is if you're working on your phone right now, blueprint.ucla.edu, addressing the policy challenges facing California and Los Angeles in particular. The magazine has been recognized for editorial and design excellence, and he serves as its editor-in-chief. Newton also serves as senior columnist, senior consultant to UCLA Magazine. Newton is a respected author of 4 important and critically acclaimed best-selling works of history. They include Justice for All, Earl Warren and the Nation He Made, Eisenhower, The White House Years, Worthy Fights, a memoir of leadership in war and peace, which was a collaboration with former CIA Director and Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. That was a New York Times bestseller. And his 4th book, Man of Tomorrow, The Relentless Life of Jerry Brown, is a history of California since 1960, as well as a biography of its longest-serving governor. He's presently at work on a biography of Jerry Garcia, which reminds me, I forgot to ask what your favorite Grateful Dead song is, but we can talk about that later. An examination of the San Francisco counterculture and its influence. It is scheduled for release in 2015 by Random House. In 2022, Newton's body of work was recognized by the American Political Science Association, which awarded him its Carey McWilliams Award, presently presented annually to an individual or organization for major journalistic contributions to society's understanding of politics. With that, please welcome Jim Newton.
Well, thank you all very much. First of all, I want to thank you for being here. I just want to say a few things of my own before I get started. First, to Professor Dr. Shannon for reaching out to me and working with me to organize the remarks today, also for hosting me and certainly for feeding me well over the last 2 days. I'm also indebted to the members of the Talarico family for your welcome. It's a pleasure to meet all of you, and it's an honor to speak in Susette Talarico's memory. One other note, it's just a pleasure to be back in Georgia. As noted, I worked at the Constitution back in the late 80s. It was one of my happiest periods as a journalist, and had the paper not undergone some kind of wrenching changes in the late 80s, I'd still be here. In any case, it's nice to be back. So with that, let me turn to the topic at hand, which I've called today Modern Policing Reform in 2 Acts. So let me start that with what, for me, is the beginning. Shortly after midnight on March 3rd of 1991, Rodney King was driving west on Highway 210, which is a few miles north of downtown Los Angeles. He'd been drinking, and he was driving fast. He also was on parole, so he was not pleased when he saw the blue lights in the rearview mirror. When the CHP, the California Highway Patrol, tried to pull him over, King sped up, and he led the officers on a chase. It was described later as a high-speed chase. He was in a Hyundai, so it probably wasn't that high speed, but it was a chase. He refused to stop, and he pulled off the highway. And when he did pull off the highway, the LAPD took over the chase from the California Highway Patrol. He finally came to a stop at an intersection in a neighborhood known as Lakeview Terrace. He had 2 passengers. They got out of the car without incident, but King resisted, and he attempted to run away. 4 LAPD officers were involved in subduing Rodney King. Lawrence Powell delivered the majority of the blows. He pounded King dozens of times with his side-handle baton, which is roughly equivalent to an aluminum baseball bat. Timothy Wind was a rookie who was training under Larry Powell that night. He joined in the blows, and he also struck King repeatedly with his baton. Ted Brasino, was late to the action, but he dealt a hard kick to King and shoved his head to the ground. This whole melee, or controlled use of force, as the officers described it in their later reports, was supervised by Sergeant Stacy Kuhn, who repeatedly used a taser on King. Together, the 4 officers tased and struck King some 56 times. They didn't stop until he lay motionless on the pavement. In effect, they beat him into submission. They broke his eye socket, his cheekbone, and bones at the base of his skull. They also broke his ankle. He was covered in bruises and cuts in the photographs taken of him after the event. Sergeant Kuhn filed the use of force report associated with this use of force. He filed it before he knew that there was a video of it, so what he described would have gone unchallenged were it not for the video. In that report, he said that King had suffered injuries of a minor nature, quote unquote. He also described the baton strikes as jabs. That deliberately understated language would later be used to implicate him. It raised the question of why understate these injuries and this event if it were not to cover up for something wrong. Kuhn and Powell, the sergeant and the officer who delivered the majority of the blows, ultimately were convicted of violating King's civil rights, but not before Los Angeles was torn to pieces by the riots that ensued after those same officers were acquitted in state court. The jury in the federal case concluded that the force was excessive, that King was the victim of violent and abusive police misconduct, and that the misconduct was willful, and therefore that it deprived King of two notably federally protected rights: his right to be safe from unreasonable arrest and his right to be safe from harm while in police custody. The verdict conformed with what most Americans concluded when they saw the tape. One poll that was conducted shortly after the tape of the incident was aired found that more than 80% of viewers saw the force as violently excessive. Kuhn and Powell both went to federal prison, though only after appealing their cases all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But what of the larger, so that resolved the legal issue with respect to Kuhn and Powell and the other officers, but what are the larger issues of police culture? Were Kuhn and Powell bad apples, as the saying often goes, or were they aberrations from a fundamentally sound police culture, or were they representative of the culture? The answer to those questions, I would say, is at least partially answered by the tape itself. If you look at the tape, you'll notice that while Kuhn and Powell and their colleagues are striking and kicking King, there are 13 other officers on the tape, from the LAPD, the Highway Patrol, and even the Los Angeles School Police, who are looking on. Not one of them appears alarmed or makes any attempt to intervene. When those officers return to their respective stations at the end of the night on March 3rd, they reported precisely nothing having gone wrong. They were later referred to as the bystander officers. None of the bystander officers ever reported anything amiss that night. To me, that suggests more than just a few bad apples. It points to a policing culture that was profoundly at odds with constitutional rules and common sense. It demonstrates that these 13 officers from various agencies saw that beating differently than 12 jurors and 80% of Americans saw it. That is a police culture that is corrupted. There are other signs of that corruption as well. I'll remind you or inform you, for those of you who don't already know these facts, of a few of those signs. In the early 1990s, when I was covering LAPD for the Los Angeles Times, the LAPD had a communication system in the cars that was known as, they were called mobile digital terminals. They were sort of precursors to laptops, and they were in the squad cars. Officers would communicate with each other using the MDT, as it was called. And they did so knowing that their communications were monitored. Supervisors were able to see them. They were subject to audit, et cetera. In other words, these were nothing private. They were public communications between officers. And yet, even knowing that these communications were monitored, the shorthand that officers used for a domestic violence incident involving an African-American couple was NHI, which stood for No Humans Involved. It didn't stop there. On the night of the King beating itself, Officer Larry Powell used his MDT to describe, this is an incident just before the King encounter, he was part of resolving a domestic violence incident involving a black couple. He described it on the MDT as, quote, right out of Gorillas in the Mist. That was 16 minutes before he encountered Rodney King. Later, the officers and their supporters would argue that it was just this was sort of bleak humor, the joking of men and women who were under stress. I would ask you, though, to ask yourselves, would any of you, under any circumstances, ever refer to an encounter with a black couple as, quote unquote, right out of Gorillas in the Mist? If not, then I think you know the answer to whether this was acceptable. Speaking of squad cars, the LAPD's signature vehicle in those years, still is, were known in the 1970s and still, to some extent, are known as black and whites. That was meant as a kind of bland, fairly innocent description of what the cars looked like. But in 1982, then police Darrell F. Gates, about whom I could tell you some stories, and we'll get back to that, he was asked why more black suspects were dying in LAPD custody than white suspects when they were subjected to a chokehold. His response was that the arteries of blacks were, quote, were different than, quote, those of normal people. By the 1990s, LAPD officers had taken to referring to the black and whites as black and normals. And that, not only was that not a secret, that's what they would call them in front of me, a reporter from the Los Angeles Times. Now, granted, there's some officers didn't know what NHI stood for or probably didn't know the history of black and normal. But that's just further evidence of how deeply racism ran within the department by the time of the King beating. It was not just a few bad apples who were trafficking in racist language. It was an embedded feature in the everyday vocabulary of the police office, or the police department. So, in the aftermath of the King beating, the city commissioned an inquiry. Tom Bradley, then the mayor, commissioned an inquiry, which became known as the Christopher Commission, and its charge was to investigate the two issues that were most at the heart of the King beating: racism and excessive force. The investigation was named for its chairman, Warren Christopher, who was one of Los Angeles' most esteemed, respected citizens. He would go on to serve as Secretary of State under President Clinton. And the Christopher Commission was a model enterprise. It was led by a team of respected lawyers from across Los Angeles. It made a fairly exhaustive, very quick, but also exhaustive study of the LAPD in the areas of racism and excessive force. And it found plenty of both. It also came upon the illuminating discovery that a relatively small number of officers accounted for much of LAPD's force. So it suggested remedies along those lines, about tracking, for instance. So the commission made a series of recommendations, and they reflected those findings that it had unearthed in the course of its inquiry. Among its recommendations, it recommended revisions to the LAPD's disciplinary process, strengthening the city's civilian oversight over its police, redoubling efforts toward diversifying the police department, some of which were underway but had sort of stalled under Gates. It also imposed a term limit on the chief of police. The commission released its report in July of 1991. Gates, still kicking and screaming, retired on June 28th of 1992, about a year later. Getting rid of Gates, though, turned out to be the easy part. The hard part was implementing the reforms. It was trying, and it was expensive. The Los Angeles Police Protective League, which is the union that represents Los Angeles police officers, resisted many of the proposals. The department dragged its feet on others. It was years, for instance, before the LAPD developed a computerized system for tracking more so-called problem officers, officers who had repeated uses of force. And it took years to do that, despite the fact that less than 10 miles away, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department already had a system in place. Implementing the reforms also cost money. Recruiting for diversity required investment. Developing and integrating software to track the complaints, even though they could have bought it from the Sheriff's Department, ultimately required investment. Staffing up the city's police commission and creating an office of the Inspector General, which the department now has, required investment as well. It was expensive, and it was deliberate, and sometimes progress was painfully slow. A few years later, by the way, this is skipping around a little bit, but when the Rampart scandal, which some of you may have heard of, erupted in the late 1990s, and revealed corruption in the city's anti-gang units, the federal government stepped in and sued Los Angeles for its continuing pattern and practice of discrimination and excessive force. The Justice Department and the city entered into a consent decree that codified some of the Christopher reforms that at that point were still incomplete. It was filed with a federal judge who appointed a monitor, and implementing that decree ended up costing the city about an additional $5 million a year, although much of that was money that the city had already pledged to spend to fulfill the reforms initially and just hadn't. Still, with steady pressure from the press, the public, the federal government, the Christopher reforms gradually fell into place. And here is the remarkable thing about those reforms, which is that they worked. They didn't just create a more responsive and diverse police department, though they also created a safer city. I'm just going to tick off a few of those achievements, if you'll bear with me. First of all, on diversity. Today's LAPD is remarkably diverse, and that's a remarkable change from its history. Through most of the 20th century, the LAPD was made up overwhelmingly of white men. In the 1950s, it recruited many of those men from the Army. It recruited some of them from the Ku Klux Klan, which, needless to say, was not a great practice. In 1965, When the Watts riots erupted, only 5 of the 205 officers assigned to South Los Angeles in the LAPD were black. As late as 1980, the department was 80% white and male. But that has changed. As of 2020, the LAPD's ranks were 30% white, 50% Latino, 9% black, and 8% Asian. About 20% female, too, by the way. That almost precisely, other than the gender representation, that almost precisely mirrors the diverse Los Angeles. Today's overall population in Los Angeles is about 71% people of color. The population of the LAPD is about 70% people of color. There are very few organizations in American society, frankly, that are as close to the diversity of the cultures that they are charged with representing. Maybe just as importantly, the reform efforts of the 1990s and 2000s did not weaken, as some police feared it would, the police's ability to detect, to deter, and respond to crime. In 1990, a year before the King beating, Los Angeles experienced about 2,400 violent crimes per 100,000 residents. In 2000, after the reforms were well underway, by 2000, the number had dropped to 1,350 violent crimes per 100,000 residents. By 2005, that number was 820 per 100,000. I realize that's a lot of numbers, but just briefly, to summarize, that's 2,400 in 1990 to 820 in 2005. That's a drop of nearly 70% in 15 years. So whatever else the King reforms, the Christopher Commission reforms did, they certainly did not make Los Angeles a more dangerous city. To the contrary. The important point from all of that is that these reforms, while they were reluctantly embraced, ultimately created not just a more restrained and respectful police force, but also a safer city. Also notably, LA, I'm focusing on LA because of course that's where my experience was, but LA was not alone in this process. Most notably, New York also embarked on a period of reform during these years, and there too, the results were remarkable in terms of falling crime. In 1990, 2,605 people were murdered in New York City. In 2005, that number was 874. So police reform of that era, what I'm calling Act One of modern police reform in this country, turned on notions of civilian oversight, community policing, in the case of New York, a computerized tracking or monitoring mapping system known as CompStat, which later came to Los Angeles too in the person of William Bratton, who was first commissioner of New York and then later chief of Los Angeles. The key to the assumption of all the reforms that were adopted in that period was that police agencies needed more resources to improve, and that investment in diversity, oversight, discipline, training would bolster the work of police and encourage and build the trust of communities and help deter crime. So that was Act One, and at least by its own terms, was remarkably successful. So now Act Two. What followed the period that I've just described was a period of improvement, though, at least in the cities that embraced reform. But while reform was happening in certain cities, it was not happening in others. It wasn't universal. In fact, some departments were ignoring the lessons of Los Angeles and New York. Others were consciously moving in the other direction. They were adopting military hardware and tactics, pulling away from communities and relying much more heavily on rapid response and SWAT than on community policing. So as the LAPD was experimenting with things like bike patrols, the police department in Ferguson, Missouri was picking up armored vehicles. Baltimore was fine-tuning military surveillance and technology. And Maricopa County in Arizona acquired a 50 caliber machine gun, 120 assault rifles, 5 armored vehicles, and 10 helicopters. Those are provided through the federal government's program known as the 1033 program, which made military equipment to law enforcement available at little or no cost. That equipment makes perfect sense for military operations, but it has, as others have observed, questionable value for police. It's intended plainly and simply to kill people. And the consequence of it is it tends to separate police from those who they are sworn to protect. It insulates them at a minimum behind vests and faceplates, inside vehicles, armored vehicles, helicopters, and other things that prevent them from communicating with folks. It transforms them shortly simply into soldiers, and it turns the city streets that they are patrolling into battlegrounds rather than neighborhoods to protect. You will not perhaps be surprised to hear that that didn't go particularly well. The introduction of vast amounts of military hardware reinforced the exact idea that LAPD and others were trying to get away from, this notion of police as an occupying army, a hostile force that entered from the suburbs during the day and rounded up people and then went home at night. Police dressed up like soldiers, and they began to act like soldiers. As that movement or that period was underway, as military hardware and mentality was spreading among many police departments, particularly sort of second and third tier police departments, politics were adjusting as well. Initially, we had 6 years of declining crime under President Obama. Violence began to tick up again in 2015. It wobbled a little bit in 2016 and 2017 when President Trump took office. It dipped a little in 2018 and then started to come back up again in 2020 and into 2021 under President Biden. So this crosses party lines. As crime began to accelerate, and as these police departments, particularly these medium-sized and smaller police departments, engaged in more military policing, the cases of police abuse came, one on top of the next. I'll just cite a few of them, which you'll know. On August 9th, 2014, Officer Darren Wilson of the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department shot and killed Michael Brown, an unarmed teenager. Protests began that night. By the next day, police, and you'll recall the pictures, ominous in their riot gear and military hardware, they confronted an increasingly restive crowd. Protesters clashed with police over the next 7 days in Ferguson until the governor declared a state of emergency, imposed a curfew, and on August 16th called in the National Guard. Those images of police in armored personnel carriers and armed with assault rifles remain with us today as reminders of the violence from that week. On March 13th, 2020, 7 Louisville, Kentucky police officers burst into the apartment of Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old medical worker whose boyfriend was suspected of drug trafficking. The officers claimed to have announced themselves, but they've not produced much evidence of that. And when they burst into the room, Taylor's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, fired his gun, hitting one of the officers in the leg. They returned fire in force. Taylor was hit by 6 bullets. She died at the scene. 4 officers were charged with violating her civil rights, and investigations of the Louisville Police Department have uncovered scores of acts of misconduct that have made Louisville into the national model today of bad policing in this country. On May 25th, 2020, Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin responded to the scene of an alleged attempt to pass a counterfeit $20 bill at a convenience store. As he arrived, officers were attempting to place George Floyd, whom they had arrested, into a squad car. Chauvin took charge of the situation, and after a series of tussles, Chauvin dropped a knee onto the back of Floyd's neck. He held it there, impassive, for more than 9 minutes, even as Floyd begged and pleaded that he could not breathe. Floyd eventually lost consciousness and was placed in an ambulance. He was pronounced dead at the hospital. I could, sadly, go on with these, and that is precisely the point. Whatever the merits of civilian oversight and diversity and community policing had, as practiced by the LAPD and others in Act 1 of this drama, by 2020, they clearly had stopped short, or fallen short of stopping police abuse or halting the killing of men and women, many of them unarmed and often black. Outraged demonstrations dominated the summer of 2020. Against the backdrop, of course, of COVID and the dismaying response of the Trump administration. By early June, violence had erupted in Minneapolis and elsewhere. 200 American cities were under curfew, and Trump was threatening to use American military force against civilians. There's a lot that's disputed about those demonstrations and the reactions to them. Here's what's clear and undisputed. Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Michael Brown and more recently Tyre Nichols were killed by police, and none of them deserved to die. Moreover, they were killed by police who may have believed that they had permission from Washington to use force, to use large amounts of force. And that's because all of this also takes place against a backdrop of politics. Pardon me. As you all know, Donald Trump was elected president of the United States in 2016. He won in part as a friend of police and turned out, in my view, to be a fairly unhelpful friend of police. Among his more questionable contributions to the history that I'm describing here today was his pledge, which was heartily endorsed by his first Attorney General, William Sessions, to scale back the government's, scale back the federal government's use of pattern and practice litigation. Under Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama, the pattern and practice litigation was accomplished by the Justice Department filing lawsuits and then resolving them with the defendant cities through the use of consent decrees. Those decrees generally spelled out the required reforms. The packages, the decrees were then filed with a federal judge who would supervise and enforce the enactment of those reforms. As I noted earlier, that's precisely what LA went through when the Rampart scandal revealed that many of the Christopher reforms were still unfulfilled, and then a federal judge saw them through to the finish, through the mechanism of the consent decree in Los Angeles. Trump and Sessions both detested that practice. Sessions, out of a lifelong commitment to states' rights. Trump, out of a sort of kind of reptilian admiration for police abuse. You may recall in 2017, he gave a speech in which he argued that too many laws were written to, quote, protect the criminal and not the officers. In that same speech, he noted the practice that many officers have of placing a hand on a suspect's head before having them enter a police car. They're often in handcuffs, and it helps them keep from bumping their heads. Trump said in his speech, "You can take that hand away," and police officers laughed, not their finest moment. That's just Trump being Trump. But the more substantive effect of walking away from these pattern and practice cases was that police agencies, with mounting problems in those years, went utterly unscrutinized by Washington. That's a 4-year period of no meaningful federal scrutiny. Now, I don't have to tell you that problems tend to fester when no one looks at them for 4 years. Under Trump, police departments knew that no matter how bad their practices were, no one from the federal government would hold them accountable. And one predictable outcome of that is that bad agencies got worse. Under President Biden and now Attorney General Merrick Garland, the Justice Department has returned to what had been the bipartisan work of police accountability. But 4 years of disuse has deepened problems in places like Louisville. And I got to say, I do believe that we will see some of these problems get worse before they begin to get better. So what's the question then as we reach the end of Act 2? Where do we go now? What does Act 3 look like? Do we adopt a model of police reform that served the nation well in the 1990s, investing in police oversight? Or do we turn in another direction toward stripping police of responsibilities and reducing funding for those agencies? Or are there perhaps third ways or combinations of those ways to look at? Much of the conversation, again, that you'll be familiar with in this area has surrounded what's become known as defunding or abolition of police. The notion behind those ideas is that police do too much that they're unqualified to do. Counseling people in distress, confronting addiction or mental illness, and that they do so from a posture of force, that they arrive as a coercive presence, often armed. The result, of course, too often is violence and resulting injury and death, where arguably patience and empathy might have yielded happier outcomes. Advocates of these ideas of defunding or related notions to it argue that taking resources away from police and investing them elsewhere would avert or at least minimize some of those situations. It would hopefully get troubled people to care rather than, of course, killing them. Within the idea, though most powerfully, moving away from the specifics and to the motivation for the idea, is the bitter truth, which is that police have, in fact, failed over and over, and they have lost the confidence and trust of many people in this country. Those are understandable sentiments. They are not to be ignored. They are, after all, true, among other things, and they have to be taken seriously. Police failure is rampant, and in many cases that we've seen in tapes, unconscionable. Still, it seems to me that on its own, defunding is unlikely to accomplish very much. To punish police abuse by eliminating police funding is, among other things, to invite violence against those who most rely on the police for protection. Those people are, it's important to note, by and large, black and brown and poor, precisely the same people, or same groups of people who are most damaged by police misconduct. In the years that I covered LAPD, by far the deepest criticism I heard of police, of the Los Angeles Police Department, came from black Angelenos. But the strongest support for police funding and police bonds came from those same communities in those same years. Those people did not want their police taken away. They wanted police to respect them. Defunding, to me, disrespects those people and their desire for safety. So if the goal of those who argue for defunding is to reduce criminal enforcement overall, that's a losing proposition, politically and otherwise. But that's not really the goal. In fact, I think sometimes it's stated as the goal in order to caricature and minimize the seriousness of this idea. The call for defunding police really doesn't begin with individual acts of excessive force, but rather by observing that we are a society that is steeped in coercion and violence. And if we skip over that part of the argument, defunding can seem ludicrous. But I think it's important not to, in fact, skip over that part of the argument. Put it this way. The appropriate response to an individual act of police misconduct is to punish the offending officer. If the problem is one of police culture, it's to fix the culture. But what if you pull back and ask a different question? For instance, why is violence so commonplace in American life? And how do police contribute to that? Another way of asking it, is police violence a police problem or is it a violence problem? I had a fun opportunity recently. I was part of a conversation with a small group of friends on this topic. The kind of frank, open conversation that you have when a reporter isn't present, although I guess I was. Maybe it wasn't that. But the table that I was at included a couple veterans of police reform, as well as some bright, thoughtful young people who were deeply affected by the events and protests of the 2020s. As we talked about these problems on this recent evening, I was struck less by our differences of opinion than I was by our differences of perspective. For the older veterans of the issue, and I reluctantly admit that I'm one of those, it makes sense to view police misconduct as a policing issue. And if you view it through that lens, as I say, the solutions are really found within policing. Officers need to be trained to respond well. They need to be held accountable. They need to be disciplined if they make errors, or they need to be fired or even prosecuted if they act egregiously. That leads to the Christopher reforms that I described before. It starts from that perspective. For younger critics, however, or other critics, I should say, those solutions seem too narrowly confined to policing. And that's specifically to policing to police in whom they have lost confidence to carry them out. So they often, I think, approach this problem as a larger failure of society. And if you see it from that perspective, it suggests different solutions. To reduce police killings in which officers confront those who are suffering from emotional stress, for instance, social workers might replace or supplement officers at the scene. More broadly, society and police would benefit from better mental health care, holistic approaches to addiction, intensified focus on homelessness, housing inequality, concerted efforts to address racism and poverty and the relationship between racism and poverty. Those are not policing issues in the traditional sense, but they end up being policing issues when other systems fail. I was thinking about this in preparation for my remarks here today. Think of the issue of homelessness. Homelessness is not a policing problem, right? Police can't solve homelessness, but it can create policing problems, and it does create policing problems. Imagine that you're the owner of a store, and you arrive one morning to find a homeless man who's camped in front of the entrance to your store. You ask him to move, and he refuses. He's not threatening, but he's blocking the entrance, and your customers are afraid to step around him. You're losing business because you've got the intransigence of this person, and so you're frustrated. Right? You call 911. That's what many people would do in this circumstance, and help is dispatched. So let's say yours is one of the cities that's trying its best to comprehend that situation as a mental health problem rather than a policing problem, rather than a robbery in progress, say. So a social worker, not a cop, responds to the scene. That makes a certain amount of sense. This situation, in fact, might be better handled by a social worker who's experienced in mental health and someone who may be better equipped than a police officer to counsel this distressed person, at least to calming down, and maybe even coax that person into care, into getting some care, which, assuming that you're living in a place that could provide that care. If all goes well, the social worker arrives, speaks compassionately to this person, this man, and he moves. Even better, he gets some help. But what happens if that man pulls out a knife, or, this being America, pulls out a gun? In that instant, that situation has changed. There is now the threat of violence, either to the social worker, to a passerby, or even to the man himself. So how does the social worker respond to that? Is there time at that point for the police to be summoned? It does no good to suggest that the social worker be armed and respond in an armed way, right? Then it doesn't matter to the homeless man whether he's killed by a social worker or a police officer. So that's not a reasonable solution. But so to see this as a policy moment, if the policy change has merely been to defund the police and entrust this situation to a social worker, then in that moment, in that situation, that policy has failed. But that doesn't mean that there's no merit, to my mind, in talking about the larger problems that lay behind that encounter. In that discussion, the great contribution, I believe, of the defund or abolition movements is that they see the encounter as more than just the moment where the knife or the gun comes out. That they, advocates of defunding, pose deeper questions about why that man is homeless, why he feels the need to be armed, whether or how we should listen to him, and how we might go about finding help rather than shooting him dead. Those questions force us to confront some gnawing truths about American life. Here's just one of those. We live in an outrageously violent country. It's something that we are so used to that it ceases to shock us, and that should shock us too. So just let me remind you for a moment of how shocked you should be. Among 15 to 24-year-old Americans, the leading cause of death is homicide, and the second leading cause of death is suicide. Not car accidents, not cancer, homicide, and then suicide. Overall, crime in this country is comparable to other Western European and wealthy countries. The United States has rates of non-lethal crime that are comparable to places like Britain and Germany and France. But an American is 7 times as likely as a German to be murdered, 25 times more likely to be murdered with a gun than inhabitants of other comparable countries. A young person in the United States is more likely to die as a result of a gun homicide than in any country on earth. Compared to comparably wealthy countries, Americans aged 15 to 24 are 49 times more likely to die from a gunshot wound. 49 times. This is not a small discrepancy. That is a number that should shock the conscience. That culture of violence expresses itself, and affects many aspects of our lives. It affects where and how we live. It affects how we get to and from our jobs, with whom we socialize, how we move through the world. And it also affects police. They feel justified in being afraid because they should feel justified in being afraid, even when they're armed, because they live and work in a society that is undeniably dangerous, especially compared to other societies around the world. So, do we need police reform along the lines that began in the 1990s in LA? More accountability, better tracking, stricter supervision, a role for the federal government? I would say yes. The Baltimores and the Louisvilles and the Fergusons clearly need to be brought at least to the standards and expectations that larger departments adopted after the King beating. But do we also need more? I would say that the answer to that is also yes. We need to ask why so many Americans are so violent. What causes this country to be such an outlier? It seems logical to think that the reasons for violence may track other conditions that are specifically or unusually American, issues such as deepening inequality, brutal shortages of housing and health care, especially mental health care. Without considering those questions, anger and violence will continue to roll downhill, where police officers will be asked to pick them up off the pavement. The results of that will be, inevitably, as they have been, brutal and tragic. Police reform in this country is urgently needed. Without it, the anguished experiences of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd will be repeated again and again, and anger will rise and crest until reluctant officials eventually give way, which they will. Police unions and reflexive defenders of the status quo are wrong to fight this fight, for it is police, in part, who are suffering from that anger. It's directed at them. It makes their lives more dangerous, too. It's better for communities to trust police, and it is safer for police to be trusted. As those reforms hopefully begin to do the work of elevating police practices, I would say that deeper inquiry and change are also needed. We should listen to those whose frustration has reached the point that they're prepared to defund law enforcement rather than let these outrages continue. They are justified in their anger and right to look more broadly for solutions. We cannot afford to live in communities that are rigid or mean, where addicts are allowed to descend into homelessness, where injustice breeds resentment, and where violence has become the norm. Those conditions affect policing, for sure, but they really should shame all of us. Only by confronting those, in the end, do we really have a hope of living in safer neighborhoods, where the homeless have a place to go, where the streets are policed by more thoughtful and restrained protectors, where law enforcement genuinely protects and serves rather than bullies and controls. Only then, in its third and, God willing, triumphant final act, will police reforms have accomplished the ambitions that were set out for them 30 years ago. I hope it does. And I hope all of you will play a role in making that happen in your education here and your work outside of here. And I thank you all for caring about these issues. Thank you. Now,